very much for coming today to talk about the middle classes. I'm very optimistic about the power of the middle classes. I think all of us in this room can count ourselves as middle class, and we can be very pleased with ourselves because the middle classes represent greater wealth. They represent high savings and investments. They push for better education standards so that our children have better opportunities. As countries get richer, as the middle class gets bigger, corruption tends to fall because we, the middle class, want transparent government. But it does also create some challenges. We demand more of the government. We want them to invest well in education. We tend to want them to invest in pensions, social security, and this can create problems in the long term. Europe's problems today, maybe, are because Europe is too middle class. We've got a range of representatives from many countries here today. Chandrajit Banerjee is from the Confederation of Indian Industry. India's the country that is growing extremely well in the last 10 years. With over 1 billion people, the size of the middle class in India is going to be world-changing. From China, we've got Xu Lihu, who comes from a country where, again with 1 billion people, higher per capita GDP today is already changing the world. We've seen that in commodity prices globally. From the external side, we also have George Magnus, a former group chief economist for UBS and an expert on emerging markets. And then we're very fortunate to have from Russia 2 representatives, Sergei Borisov from Sberbank, head of small business development, and also Sergei Katirin from the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. If I can start, George Magnus, you've looked at many emerging markets over a few years. Perhaps you would give a couple of minutes on your thoughts about the middle class and what this means for the world.
Sure. Thank you very much, Charlie, and very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. There are roughly, according to international organizations, about 1.8 billion people defined as middle class in the world today, defined as earning between $10 and $100 a day. And the IMF thinks that this is going to grow to about 3.25 billion by 2020 and to almost 5 billion by 2030. Over 3/4 of the increase in this population of the middle class will be in Asia for the most part. The significance, of course, is because we associate a rising middle class with things that are dynamic and basically good in economic terms, like entrepreneurship, innovation, sophistication, modernity, and so on. And in fact, if you want to kind of look at these numbers in more detail, you know, the United States and Western Europe, for example, which today constitute about 48–50% of this universe of middle-class people, is going to drop to about 22%. So clearly, if you believe your spreadsheets, then the next 20 years is, as they say in American baseball, a slam dunk. In other words, it's inevitable and it's going to happen without fail. My point about this that I want to make here in the introduction really is that it's not preordained. It does not necessarily mean just because the spreadsheets say it'll happen, that it will happen or that it'll happen everywhere. And as Charlie indicated at the beginning, the rise of the middle class is potentially a very disruptive social and political phenomenon, which obviously we would welcome, but actually we should be aware of what that implies. The key thing really is the rise of the middle class is not about GDP, and it's not about the kinds of projections that we would make, even though we feel very enthusiastic about what we see going on around us. The last 20 years are not necessarily a good guide to the future, as every piece of financial advice always says in the small print at the bottom. And the key thing, which we'll come into during the discussion really, is that what happens to the development of the middle class really depends about what happens politically in terms of the development of constructive, strong government institutions, about the right balance between the role of the state and the role of the private sector, because you don't get entrepreneurship and innovation unless you have a very, very vibrant private sector. You have to have the right trade structure, you have to be able to diversify into the things that will bring money to the country and allow it to save and invest. And there are many other things that we'll come across during this discussion. So my overall kind of bottom line really for this discussion is that we stand at the cusp of a huge potential to have a much, much more prosperous world in the next 20 years as more and more people potentially can become so-called middle class in terms of rising per capita income. But I don't think we should assume that this is necessarily going to happen everywhere or in a linear fashion.
If I could move to India, because India is the country with the biggest numbers, absolute numbers, in the long term, but still a per capita GDP of under $2,000. In Russia or Brazil or Poland, we're talking $10,000 to $12,000. So India has the furthest to go. There's been some interruption on the growth in the last 12 months. I was wondering, Chandrajit, if you could explain how you see India developing here.
Let me thank you. It's great to be back here year on year, and thanks for giving us this opportunity from India. Let me first talk about how the middle class is shaping up in India. We heard some numbers globally. Let me talk about some Indian numbers. We are today talking in terms of 31 million households in India which are classified as middle income or middle class. And if you really look at the growth of the middle class over the last few years, just in 1995 we were talking about 4.6 million households to be in the middle income group. As lately as 2005 we were talking about 13%, and we are today talking about 13 million households, and today we are talking about 31, and the number is going to grow up to anything between 125 and 130 million households by 2025. So that's very strong pressure of the numbers that we are dealing with in India in terms of people coming into the number of households that are coming in. And we are expecting around, say, 265 million people in that group in the next 5 years' time. So the numbers are quite big, and and if you really look at the next 10 years, we are talking anywhere between 50 million people in the bracket which would be termed as middle income and middle class group. But what's happening really is, which is very unique factors in India, and I wanted to highlight a couple of them, is the young demographics, which is mixed with this that we enjoy here today, and the middle class being dominated by that. Say 50% of our population is below the age group of 25, and 2/3 of our population is below the age group of 35, and it's seen that majority of that is again being classified as within the middle income group, the middle class. Second, about 65% of Indians are in the working age group of 15 to 64. Which is again predominantly in the middle class, and giving the country significant edge in terms of cost competitiveness and low labor cost. This is a very significant number, and we are going to add the maximum number of into the labor force in terms of the size. If you really look at the size of the Indian economy, the largest numbers we are going to add in the labor force by 2050, and the maximum is going to really come again from the middle class. The third area which is making a very strong impact in India from the middle class is on the issues of education and skill levels. They say that in India there is no unemployment, there is unemployability. And that's the issue today when the government and the private sector has got together to really look at the middle class and train around 500 million people by 2020. So these are big numbers, big targets, but these are, and it's really coming from the middle class in terms of and how you raise your education level, how you are really focusing on government policies which will raise education levels and skill levels, which will in turn generate more employment and employability, which would again further strengthen the middle class and the voice of the middle class. So that's I would think a very important factor to really note. And the fourth point is urbanization in India, which is also defining markets exceedingly strongly, and that's again a trend which is side by side as to how the middle class is growing and how urbanization in India is really taking place. For the first time, the urban population in India has grown at a faster rate than the rural population. And again, which is predominantly dominated by the middle class. And 87 cities in the country would have a population of more than 1 million this year, which is phenomenal number, again dominated by the middle class. So that's how we are really seeing middle class really defining some of the role. And I will touch on the last point is on three issues: technology, social media, and connectivity.
We'll come back to that. If I can move to Shuli, I know you've also talked about urbanization as part of the process of the middle class developing in China. Perhaps you could give us a couple of minutes on China's outlook as well.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning. I just want to say, like, the concept of middle class is a internationally understood word, but it's not that popular or mentioned that much in China. People in China like to say the local people and the rural people in the urban area and in rural area. And actually, right now, most of the middle class people are gathered, put together in the urban area. So once we talk about the middle class, actually we talk about the urbanization as the same thing. I think so it's a little bit tricky to talk about the concept of middle class. The first challenge in China is to define the term. Some define it by income and some others add some other parameters, including assets and education. And I try to use both. And if we define the middle class as those who earn 3 times China's GDP per capita, and then exclude the richest 5%, we make sure all of them are asset owners, and we come to the number 250 million. China has 250 million people in the middle class. Because of the gaps of the urban area and the rural area, I have to say, the proportional terms, they are 38% of the urban population. It's quite a big number, 38% of the urban population, but only 18.5% of the country's total population. So the number is significant in cities already. But the very majority of Chinese people are still low income or lower middle class, lower middle income, I think. So if we look carefully at the goals of the new Chinese leadership, they pledge to expand the middle class, of course in their own language, to improve the quality of life for the middle class. So in terms of income, the CCP Congress has unveiled the promise to double people's income by 2020. 7 years from now. And in terms of quality of life, Chinese leaders talked about a better job, a better life, a nice environment, better medical care, and a reliable social safety at all. All the goals are most important to middle class. But there comes the real challenge. If the first phase of China's urbanization process is turning rural land, not people, rural land into a base for urban development, the next step, which China has to be urbanization of the people. It means that people really migrant to city and stay there and with the same level of life as middle class, or get the channel to become middle class, not only migrant to the seasonal migrant. That means that they go to the urban area, work, and during the winter, they back to the rural area. There's no urbanization of people, so there's no way to expand the middle class. Right now, we think about in China, the big challenge is urbanization of the people, so migrant workers can settle down in cities. So they can become more skilled laborers and feel more comfortable spending money. Urbanizing the people is important to expand the middle class. And their spending ability and skills are also economic drivers that can move China up the production value chain. So we have already waited too long, and we can't afford further delay, because the growth of our middle class in China is in a very unbalanced way, I should say. So there are also other important issues I think about the middle class, but I want to emphasize more about the urbanization in a balanced way.
Thank you. It would be great to hear from you, Sergei, Katerin, about how you see the middle class and Russia working together.
I believe that it's not only about Russia, but about all the countries that are members of BRICS, and maybe even more than BRICS. The middle class will be the dominating force on which the actions of politicians and economists will depend. Well, we all represent our own countries, and I'm absolutely sure that you will agree that the level of education, medical care, and many other things in our countries depend on the requirements of the middle class. And I believe that this is a standard at which the government should look, which the government should heed. And, well, in the BRICS countries, the middle class is about 20% on average. So if these people are not happy with education, with medical care, with social security and so on, then we will become economies that will work according to the shift method. So this middle class makes money, it wants to spend money, and if they don't have a good level of medical education, a good level of health care and education, they will not be able to spend the money in their countries, in our countries. So these kids, the kids within these families go abroad to get education, and they go to universities in other countries, they go to resorts to other countries on vacation, and so on, and they come to their country as though they are seasonal workers. I told you about the shifts method. So they come in shifts. They come, they leave, and so on. And if the government ignores this, well, these will be people who will just come, make money in our countries, and leave to third countries to spend this money, unfortunately. Let us not forget that these people have assets in foreign countries, and, well, maybe not yachts, and not luxury goods, but they have assets that they use when they go to these other countries. This is a serious challenge, believe me. And if the economies of our countries don't start servicing the middle class, then I believe we will have gaps, we will have deficits. And I don't believe that this is an ongoing process. Well, for example, I'm not claiming that people from the north of Russia are going on vacation to Spain, for example, to Spain alone and so on. No, of course. Well, for example, if the medical care if the healthcare system is not up to the mark, people can go to this country or another country and so on. But this migration of the middle class is something that is happening in all countries, especially in countries like ours. So we should improve healthcare, we should improve the educational system, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the government programs that have been adopted in the BRICS countries, you will easily see that these programs are mostly about addressing these challenges in order to satisfy the middle class again. This is only natural. And the second thing, I believe that it's even more important. This is the political factor that I wanted to talk about. The middle class has always been a class of asset owners. These people own something, and it was a stabilizing force. So, well, I believe that the pendulum will never sway to the extreme right or to the extreme left if you have the solid middle class. The middle class has a lot to lose in their countries, in foreign countries. They have assets, as I said, and they will always stand out for stability. Well, they may go a little bit to the left, they may shift a little bit to the right, but they like stability. They enjoy stability. Stability in the country, stability in the economy, stability in politics, and so on. So I just wanted to come to the concept that I started with. I believe that the middle class is the dominating force for most countries, and the middle class comes as a leader. Thank you.
Then move over to Sergei Borisov, because we were talking about the middle class wants stability, but you're suggesting the middle class must be entrepreneurial. They must be risk-taking. They must be ambitious and pushy. I was wondering, what can you tell us about that?
Спасибо, Чарли.
Charlie, thank you very much. In Russia, very often we try to find a definition for the middle class, and I believe that this is no easy task. I believe that we will never come to a common denominator, even within the BRICS countries. We have 5 countries within the BRICS. There is different pricing policy. Well, somebody needs a fur coat, somebody doesn't need a fur coat, somebody doesn't have a winter at all, and so on. But generally speaking, we understand that the middle class means that these people have enough money for education, for their everyday life, for sending their kids on vacation. They have a couple of notebooks, they have a couple of cars, or maybe one car, and that's the middle class, more or less. In Russia, the middle class is growing. Numerically, it's not growing that fast, frankly speaking. But we were at less than 20% when we started introducing a market economy. Now we have over 30%. And experts, well, believe that 10% of this country is the affluent population, and we have about 15 million people living below the poverty line. And this is very dangerous for the national security, for our economy, and the gap between the most affluent and the poorest country is about 15 basis points. In Germany, it's only 6. In Nordic countries, 3.4, and this is a dangerous trend. You know, I have been studying small businesses, and well, I headed an organization that is in charge of studying small businesses, and I met and spoke with experts from all over the world, and one expert told me this when we were discussing the middle class. He said, "Tell me what the middle business is in Russia, and I will tell you what your middle class is about." So small business is the economic basis, the fundamentals for everything, for the economy. And, well, Sergei was right. Well, people will have more requirements to the physicians, to the doctors, to the teachers, to the professors, and so on. The middle class is the innovational class. And if competition is good, if it is developed, then small businesses will have to compete to make money and so on. And, well, they will have to educate their kids, which means that the educational sector will be getting finances. Well, I want to be healthy. I go to good physicians, not too bad ones. So there will be higher demand there, and the economy will growing. Well, I believe that the middle class is still underdeveloped because, well, many people belonging to the middle class are working in the oil and gas sector. Well, we have the oil dollars, the so-called Dutch disease, when we depend on oil and gas, and this is a very dangerous situation. If there is a slump in the oil and gas sector. If the prices for oil and gas go down, well, the money that we are getting through the oil and gas sector will not be going to the pockets of the middle class. Well, unfortunately, with the middle class, we have not achieved that much, though we grew in the past 10 years by 37%. Small business gives 23% in terms of GDP. Well, I know that in the BRICS countries is more or less the same, and employment 25%. But wise people are saying that it's not about the state in which you are, it's about the direction that you're taking and where you're moving. Although we have made a couple of mistakes, a couple of errors in our pension system, we are trying to rectify it using the small businesses here. So the future of the middle class, I believe, depends on the SME sector developing. Thank you.
Which is similar to what George was talking about with the strength of the private sector. That's part of what will drive growth, and small and medium-sized enterprises will be part of that. I'm just thinking in terms of the problems and opportunities. Education has come up, and it came up at a conference earlier this year. Anatoly Chubais was saying he's more scared by the education drain out of Russia than he is by the capital flight out of Russia. It worries him more. I was looking at some numbers for things like literacy, and it does extremely well, 100% literacy, and this is very successful, better than most emerging markets. But Russia's education system, while the Russian population is better educated than almost any emerging market, the number of new technical journals, the number of new research papers coming out of Russia has been falling for 20 years. It seems like there's been a lack of investment in education here. So that's an area, in contrast to India and to China, where the number of technical and scientific papers being produced is going up dramatically. So education, the government seems to have done a better job investing in education, at least from the starting point. So I'm interested in the thoughts on education, but also this long-term issue of pensions and social security. At the moment, my belief is that pensions are very low in India and China. But as countries get richer, they demand more. And the government, when times are good, spends more. And we've seen this in Korea. There was an election in Korea just a few months ago. The lady who won that election, she won promising much more social security, much more welfare spending. Now in Europe, that's causing us problems. But in Russia, we've already seen that too. Putin has been increasing spending on pensions considerably. So you've got two issues here. I'd love to have your thoughts on education and what can be done to improve education in Russia now, and also the issue of pensions. If I could come back to Sergei, because you did mention this, and then perhaps George afterwards to talk about the middle income trap and some of these related issues.
Earlier on, we used to say there were two tragedies in Russia. You know the end of the phrase, right? Now we are faced with one challenge, lack of not education, but actual investments in science. Back in communism, there was a state agency for science and education, whose job it was to invest funds in, to translate some, scientific research and discoveries into practical projects. And back then, there were thousands of various projects going on, including fundamental research and applied research. However, we have never been, we have never been good at applying fundamental research and discoveries and inventions to some practical applications. Now, the pattern today has reversed a bit, and maybe we're lagging behind in terms of fundamental research. but we have been picking up in the application part. And the idea is that sometimes it takes years and years, of course, to conduct a series of research before we can actually consider applying its results. And I believe that you're absolutely right, saying that there's a lack of maybe investment in this. I'm not that much of an expert. I cannot say for sure that our science has been lagging behind along certain lines of work. I'm not sure. Maybe the picture is much more sophisticated and complicated. It's just drawn at first sight. So I think that Russia does have some competitive edge. Not that all of us, 100% of academia is just lagging behind. This is not the case, I guess. Maybe, well, the pace has slowed down. And the idea of the implementation, again, is up top on the agenda. So the idea is to create this chain of supply as it can apply to academia, to scientific research. The idea is not only to come up with an invention, the idea is also to make sure that this invention actually works and is implemented out there in the markets. So this, unfortunately, this is the weak link in our chain of academic supply, if I may use the term. So, but the good news is that the number of let me put it this way. It's not the good news. The thing is that it's not about brain drain. It's not about what Mr. Chubais mentioned. There's this educational brain drain, right? The idea is that it's not about people leaving Russia for trying to find ways to grow professionally elsewhere. This is about the fact that they can take ideas with them. This is the point. Not just the brain drain, it's the idea brain, if I may paraphrase the term. This is something that should keep us worried, and this is something that we should consider investing more in to make sure that young scholars use their ideas here. And for that to happen, we should ensure them that their ideas can be implemented here. Maybe this should be one of the top priorities. So implementation, I would put it this way, implementation in the way that, I mean, your theoretical research should, at the end of the day, end up on drawing boards and actually be implemented so in real terms in the market, so that you can return on your investment, on your intellectual investment. Now, on to the other issue of Social Security and pensions. Of course, we're going through some tough patches, so kind of rough time we're going through, and some, well, mistakes that Sergei mentioned were committed, unfortunately, early on, which is something that undermined our commitment to developing small and medium-sized businesses. Actually, this is something that throw us back in time. Also, psychologically, people are not comfortable now, distrusting a little bit the government when it comes to small and medium-sized businesses, and fiscal law needs some fixing and adjusting, of course, so that Russia meets the imperatives of time in terms of small and medium-sized businesses. So that's true, no question asked. As to pensions, we should be able to find a happy medium in a way. So. Like something between the Korean model and European model. So it's not that, I'm not talking about, in fact, pensions only. This is about trying to strike balance between the needs to invest in economic growth on the one hand, and the needs, of course, to make sure that our pensioners get what they deserve. Thank you.
Step in. I will just mention one thing. I looked at these education levels and found that Russia has produced more Nobel Prize winners so far than China, India, or Brazil and South Africa put together. So Russia's intellectual tradition is fantastic. What's changing is that so many other countries are coming up, and Russia, the last 3 Nobel Prize winners from Russia have left the country. Which addresses Sergei's point too. But over to you.
Right, you are indeed. Traditionally, Russia has always been good at aspiring to be knowledgeable. Maybe this runs in the family, this runs in our blood, and this is something that we have inherited from the past. So we invented some good stuff from the past as well, other than just mistakes and everything. Now, with regard to small and medium-sized businesses, maybe there's there's no lack of potential. The potential is out there. Unfortunately, small and medium-sized businesses have not been able yet so far to implement again their knowledge and practice. What they are lacking as well is maybe the knowledge of the market. On a yearly basis, we run surveys, public opinion polls, and we keep asking our respondents, what impediments prevents you from developing your small businesses? And many responses indicate to bureaucracy, to bureaucratic impediments and hurdles, and in part it used to be the case. Whereas now, all of our respondents point to the lack of expertise and human resources. 47% of respondents mentioned that it's the lack of human resource, qualified, and skills, lack of skills. Number two, taxes. Number three, access to capital, like being able to borrow and getting some cheap loans. So those are three impediments. And like I said, the number one concern is this the lack of the necessary skills for you to be a successful entrepreneur. On to the issue of pensions, of course, pensioners should benefit from the system in a dignified way. However, you should not put the cart ahead of the horse. First, in order for pensions to be, for the government to be able to pay out pension benefits, it has to generate incomes and fill in the coffers with cash. So first, horse should come, and then comes the cart. Let's do a math. Somebody come up with this number. What needs to be generated in order for the pension system to be operational and to be effective? And we're talking about, okay, so from your income you have to pay 20 or 30%, fine, right? However, the method was different. So this is the absolute amount. It's not a relative amount, but an absolute dollar amount that you, the entrepreneur, have to pay. Otherwise, you fail the tests. And this is what happened in Russia, in fact, right? And nearly 600,000 small and medium-sized businesses ceased to exist since this reform took place, as a matter of fact. Now that they stopped operating, they went down to black market.
Well, I'm just going to, if I can bring in George first, because I'd like him, he's looked at the middle income trap. He's looked at countries struggling with issues of education budgets, welfare spending, and I think that has a bearing then on both India and China. So I'd love to have you after George.
Sure. So I'd just like to emphasize something that I touched on at the beginning, which is that some things matter disproportionately as you get richer. Now, obviously, if we think about the Brics, obviously it's a disparate group of countries. They have very little in common, actually. But obviously Brazil and Russia are high middle-income countries. India is a low middle-income country. China is a middle income country. But some things matter disproportionately as you get richer. And the things that matter a great deal are shifting the structure of your economic model towards, as I said before, entrepreneurship, innovation, being smarter. There are some things you can only do once. You can only join the World Trade Organization once. Okay, Russia obviously is a very recent joiner, so maybe some of the benefits of joining the WTO will come through in ways for Russia as they had come through for China before. But you can only join international organizations like this once. You can only do labor transfer from low productivity rural activity to high productivity manufacturing once. You can only urbanize to 80, 85, 90% of the population once. You can only get 90% of your children enrolled in school once. So once you've done all these things, you have to get smarter. You have to think about ways in which you can make your institutions work harder. And one of the things which I think, well, we've touched on 2 or 3 of the things that really matter: education, social spending, and innovation or R&D. So while we can celebrate a lot of what the BRICS and other emerging markets have achieved in the last 20 years, we should also be aware that the process in the future is going to be really at least as hard as it has been, if not harder, in the past. So, for example, if you look at education enrollment at what we call tertiary sector, so universities and technical colleges after secondary school, in the G7 countries, it's about 65%. In Asia, it's about 30%. In Latin America, it's about 40%. So there's a long way to go if you want to kind of get up to that high income level, and it requires a lot of careful thinking about how you get kids into tertiary education and what you teach them when you get there. There's no point bringing out people with, degrees or qualifications which actually aren't particularly useful to the economic development path or model that you choose to pursue. The same goes with innovation and R&D. I mean, Charlie, you mentioned scientific papers before, and obviously there's a lot of research is going into, patents and I mean, I think according to the US Patent Institute, I think China actually is #1 now in terms of patents. But actually what matters isn't the volume of patents, but actually the patents that are cited by your peers in other disciplines or in the same discipline. So on that basis, there is still, again, a long way to go, because obviously there's a lot of plagiarism, there's a lot of duplication that goes on. People, scientists, engineers are often incentivized to produce papers for different reasons other than adding to the stock of knowledge. So again, with R&D, the US and some of the more kind of high-income countries in Europe still have quite a strong edge in terms of R&D spending as a share of GDP. And then finally, public social spending. I mean, in China, it's still extremely low. It's about 7% of GDP, compared with about 17% in Brazil and in Russia. But even that is at the bottom end of the OECD. The OECD minimum share of public social spending as a share of GDP is about 21–22%. So how do you pay for that? And especially in aging countries, right? So in Russia and China, I mean, these are countries, I call them the hares rather than the tortoises in global demographics, because these are the countries that are aging very quickly. The burden of pension spending and of healthcare is rising very, very quickly because of the speed with which the population is aging. The age structure is increasing. So how do you pay for that? And I think I haven't really come across better examples, really, to date, than you've got to pay for it by having a diversified, dynamic industrial structure, which is heavily centered on manufacturing. So, China has it. It's done it already. But actually, most of the other BRIC countries and emerging countries don't have that kind of intensity of manufacturing. So I think that when we think about this in the future, about how do we afford better education, better social spending, better living standards for the middle class, which is what we're here to talk about, I think the thing is you've got to come back to really what your industrial model, what your economic model looks like, and is it appropriate for what you aspire to in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And I think in many cases, there are a lot of questions that need answering.
I'm conscious that I had at least one more question I wanted to ask. And in about 10 minutes, I'd also like to open this up to questions from the audience. Okay.
Exactly. All I need just one second. As a follow-up to distinguished professor said, research, R&D, and innovations. Or the lack thereof, in fact, has to do with the lack of some fundamental and basic institutions. Take Russia, for instance. low level of competition, or the complete lack of competition, makes all of these smart technologies, innovations out of demand. There's no demand for this. There's no competition. So if there's tough competition, of course, you have the competitive edge if you implement some smart technologies. However, in Russia, this is the point. This is our weakness, that there's no need for you to invest in technologies and patents and innovations, because still, there's no competition. There's a lot of monopolistic part here.
I think it's very common for the middle class in China to share the same, higher expectation on their living standard, and especially in education and in pension, a lot of social welfare issues. But here I want to emphasize several special points about, I just want the special characters of China's middle class. I think number one is that because China's economy in the past years have developed greatly, but with a very high cost in the environment. So the middle class in China right now is very, very sensitive about the environment issues. They start to require very high, should be totally different than before, the high requirement for their living, for the new projects that's going to start in their own cities, and all the recent years, all the unrest which could lead for violence or at least demonstration are related with environmental issues. So I think that is the first, first special character I want to mention. The second is that because the development of the middle class, which is also, as I mentioned, is very fast. But it's developed and distributed in an unbalanced way. I said in region, more in a coast area and less in the inland area, and also in the urban area, it's different from the rural area, as mentioned. So people, I think middle class are very, very sensitive about, and because that kind of unbalanced distribution of middle class lead kind of expansion of poor and rich. So the gap between income gap becomes much larger, and so middle class are very sensitive about this kind of unbalanced situation, and with a very strong voice, not only speaking for themselves, but also thinking a lot of the social fairness and justice. So they are the major group to think about the in-depth changing in this area, and a strong supporter for rule of law. And also, the third character, I think, because there are a lot of property conflicts issues in China recently, and because of growth of middle class who are very aware of the property right issue. So they are always very strong with some conflicts, some unrest also, as mentioned, which is with land issues, with housing issues that are very obviously is some show their unsatisfaction supported or worked together by middle class. And I also want to emphasize that the fourth character is that China's middle class all the people are the major internet users, and so even China is still a country considered one party's leadership, and also lack of freedom of press in certain way. But actually, internet helps middle class in China to go through internet. Especially recently, we developed we called micro blog to show their opinions directly. Right now, there are 200 million microblog users who can show their different opinions in the microblog instantly. So that is a very special channel for China, for people to understand the basic demands, the values, and the trend of middle class. That's all.
Thank you. Chandrajit, before I come to you, I'd like to introduce one last question from me before moving to the audience. A couple of years ago, I wrote a research report at Renaissance about democratization and saying that as the middle class gets, as countries get richer, they all become democracies. And I didn't just write this because I work for Prokhorov. I wrote the piece because it seems to be totally accurate, unless you export a lot of oil. So the Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, it's a different story. There's another strong link, not just that all countries become democracies, but also that all countries become less corrupt. At low income levels, corruption is a big problem. If you look at Transparency International surveys, all countries with low income, including India, will have a significant problem with corruption. But as countries get richer, the middle classes demand more transparency. And we've been seeing that in India over the last year or two. Big corruption scandals. We're seeing it in China, with the middle class even stronger and also wanting to reduce corruption. And there's even an anti-corruption campaign happening in Russia. So starting with India, but feel free to touch on the education pension stuff, but I'd be quite interested by what you see as the strength of the middle class and the impact that is now having on Indian politics.
Okay, let me get the issue about education and pensions first, and then I'll come to your question. Now, over the last few years, we are seeing a very strong involvement of the government on the education sector, especially because it's been driven by the demand that is really coming from the middle income group. The gross enrollment ratio, which is the number of people really going into the higher education, has leaped over the last decade, if you will see, and which has been proactively targeted in increasing in colleges, the number of technical institutes being doubled, the number of vocational training institutes being increased. But one important thing which I really wanted to say is in India we are seeing a growing trend of a public-private participation in tackling this issue of education. So a large number of the private sector is being involved and getting involved, and it's also good. The model is extremely beneficial for the private sector to get involved in that, in targeting that level of education in the country. So on one hand, you have the private sector getting involved in the vocational training institute, privatization of the existing government system, or seeing to it that the private sector is getting more and more involved in it. And secondly, we are also seeing a lot of private-public partnerships, PPPs, models emerging in the education field, which is one way of tackling the huge issue of education which India is also challenged with. Coming onto the social side, specifically remaining the regulatory framework which governs the pension side in India is very strong today. And I think that's very evolved. We have regulatory mechanism on that. So that's something which has evolved very strongly. Number two, today, if you see a middle income group, the middle class really spends about 50% on its household and 50% it saves. So our growth is quite propelled by the type of savings rate that we have in the country. And the number of institutions that we have seen develop in India in terms of the options, the private sector getting involved in the financial sector very strongly, the type of options that an individual have in terms of savings is quite remarkably different from what it was in the past. So one does see quite a bit of a change which has really happened. But at this point in time, it's of course a strong balance which is required in terms of the type of demands that we have, which really comes from the middle class in terms of social security. And in an absence of social security net, in an absence of a social security of certain kinds, we are also faced with the challenge as to how do we deal with some of our labor regulatory mechanism in India. So that's a process which will take time, I guess, to evolve out. I'll come to your third point, which is basically talking about the issue of corruption and how we have been able to deal with it. I think we are going through a situation of short-term pain and a long-term gain. And in the sense that you have seen movements in India where we have we have been strongly talking about accountability in more and more areas. I think the demand of accountability, not only from the government, but from all institutions, have become very strong. And this movement, as you will know, has come from the middle class, and primarily because the demographic of the middle class being led by the youth. And I think that's extremely important, because that has far-reaching implications on the political system, far-reaching implications on the social system, and it's extremely important that we are seeing this in India coming very consciously from the middle class, and very effectively so. And I think this is going to be very defining for the future of India.
Can I just say, I just think that's extremely optimistic. I mean, I hope you're right, but you know, I mean, there's a very prominent Indian commentator whose name just escapes me, who basically talked about the degradation of our state institutions as the reason why India has failed so far to diversify its economy, you know, to create jobs, to create power and infrastructure and so on. So I think you're right. You know, there is hope that a rising middle class will demand political change. But I'm not quite sure how long that's going to take to happen. And I think the requirement for political reform, be it in India or actually, as Hushuli has said, in her own country, I mean, is just absolutely critical. Without that, you know, this kind of middle income trap that I've been talking about actually is just around the corner. Maybe further away for India because it's a poorer country, but very real prospect.
If I can just open this. If I can open this up, if anybody else would like to add in a question, I know we're on the sexy stuff now of politics, but if anybody wants to ask an extra question, please raise your hand. I have a couple at the front.
How do you do? I'm Ruben Beltran, the ambassador of Mexico to the Russian Federation, and I want to congratulate the panelists. Actually, my question would be, of course, we are focusing on the BRICS countries, but actually it would be a good idea also to have some sort of benchmarking of how the rest of the emerging economies are doing in the world in terms of what you're just saying right now, in terms of income, in terms of other science and technology, investment in education, and also development of the democracy and other issues that are being highlighted here. Thank you very much.
Sorry, there was just one more. Excuse me, man with the microphone. Up to the front, please. Just to the front, in the grey suit.
Спасибо. Ямало-Ненецкий округ.
I'm from the Ямало-Ненецкий area. The agenda has the following issues. So what should the world community and the business community do to improve the situation? Well, you know what situation I'm referring to. So this is what I wanted to hear. What kind of measures should the government take, and what should the business community do to improve the situation? Well, if you ask me, I would tell you in a nutshell what I would do. The government should not stand in the way, and the business community should be responsible, and well, the government should listen to the business community, and the business community should ask the government what it is doing in its turn.
Thank you. I will come back now to Chandrajit, if you'd like to add something. You were going to...
No, I think I do. One of the strengths of India, for which that optimism comes in, is from the fact that we have a very strong democracy in place, and I think that leads me to believe that we would be able to deal with the type of responses that we are seeing from the civil society, and especially, again, as you rightly had said, that it comes from the middle class when it comes to issues which relates to governance, which relates to the overall issue of how we are able to deal with the social fabric, and especially interventions of the government. And I think we are a bit of a noisy democracy. There's no doubt about it. and that leads to various decisions at times taking a little longer than normal in terms of coming to but when you are coming to a decision, I think what's very important to be seen in the context of India, that we have really taken it through a huge number of levels in terms of the society, in terms of checks and balances, before we are able to come with a proper regulatory mechanism. And I think that's becoming quite established and institutionalized in India, which gives a very strong the optimism that you see in India really comes from that. And I think that's going to be a very important factor as we go ahead.
I'd also like to ask, given that we've seen demonstrations in China recently and also Russia in December 2011, do you think it's middle-class pressure which has encouraged the anti-corruption campaigns from the leadership of both China and Russia? Do you think it's the middle class that's caused the anti-corruption campaign?
I think that middle class is the core, because that is just I mentioned fairness and justice. Middle class is very sensitive about these kind of issues, and that it is part of their value to do something to have the country better, including like anti-corruption and also the fairness toward poor people like that. So I think it is.
No, well, if you ask me about the rallies in the Bolotnaya Square, it was not about corruption. I believe that people were unhappy with the outcome of the elections, but, well, some people are happy, some people are unhappy. That's natural, but on the other hand, I believe that what is going on in this country, in Russia, has made people come out to the streets, take out to the streets, and if we're talking about fighting corruption, then well, to fight corruption, we should write down in our laws and in our regulations and procedures how we should do away with corruption, or how we should stave off corruption. Well, we know that apart from official corruption, we have unofficial, as we call it, corruption. Well, for example, when you go to school and, well, you bring a cake or a box of candy for the teacher and so on. Well, this is not corruption, but, well, this is corruption on the other hand. And if every person does not understand that you don't have to bring boxes of chocolates or bottles of alcohol as presents and so on, you just have to pay 100 rubles and your kid will go to school or to kindergarten, and you have to take him back home in the evening without paying anything. Well, I believe that if we understand this, this will be a better world. And I believe that in many countries of the world we see such examples. Well, I was talking about procedures, but then there are laws that have direct impact. When, for example, it's written down in law that this procedure of, for example, bidding for tenders should go on like this without any reference to bylaws, to regulations, and so on. And I believe that these direct impact laws will be very important. And then the third thing, when we are talking about corruption, we're talking about bureaucrats. And as though these bureaucrats come from Mars, they're not living among us. But when we talk about corruption, there are two parties to corruption. One gives and the other one takes. No, I'm not talking about us sitting here. No, maybe, I don't know. You tell me. And if both sides, if both parties don't stop this, well, I don't believe that somebody will succeed. I believe that democratization and the emergence of the middle class and the growth of small business should be on a par. These are things that are equally important for us. Well, people don't get involved in political intrigues when they're making money through small businesses. People don't want to see rallies in the streets, people breaking shop windows and so on. But on the other hand, if a person does not know what to do, does not know how to apply his talents, his or her talents, well, this is food for extremism, as I say. So in the Bolotnaya Square in December 2011, there were hardly any entrepreneurs there, but well, on the other hand, in Moscow 2 years ago, there were many kiosks, like well, small shops in the streets that were torn down when the new mayor came, and these people ended up somewhere looking for a job, so maybe they ended up in these rallies. So, well, corruption is widespread, but we have introduced, the business community, we have introduced a very good system of assessments and so on. And we set out filters when there are draft laws being discussed before they get to the parliament and so on. And we look for loopholes, we do away with them. And about 5 to 7 years ago, small businessmen would pay 10% of their income, of their profit, as bribes. Now it's 5%. Well, 5% is still a lot, but it's going down. So the sky is the limit. We know that we have a lot to do.
Comment, actually, which was to answer your question. But actually, both of the Sergeys have answered it more eloquently than I probably would have been able to. But my immediate response to your question was the rule of law. You asked what governments should do about bad business practices or corruption. And I mean, lots of countries have laws, but sometimes it is rule by law rather than rule of law. In other words, whoever happens to be in control or, you know, in running the state or the authority actually fundamentally has kind of sway, holds an influence over the judiciary and over legal processes and judicial arbitration. So I'm not saying, you know, I'm Brit, so I'm not saying that we're perfect, and I'm not saying that the Western countries really are devoid of corruption or of bad practices. But, you know, it's all relative, and, you know, Charlie's already referred to one survey, you know, the World Bank's Doing Business survey, and there are lots of other surveys of institutional practices which rank countries according to the quality of their judicial systems and governance and so on. And I think that, you know, one way, and it's an important way, it's not the only way, but one way in which you can try to, or which governments should try to eradicate or lower the proliferation of corruption is to have, you know, a strong, independent judiciary where people feel included and have rights to protect their claims, whatever they happen to be. So I know it's easy to say as we're sitting here, and it's a very difficult process to do, and there are very strong vested interests that sometimes mitigate against it. But it's a struggle that I guess we'll have to continue with.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to wrap up by just drawing a couple of numbers to your attention. In China, in 2003, there were 7 million cars in the entire country. Today, 14 million a year are being sold, and 20 million vehicles altogether. They sell more in 6 months than China ever had 10 years ago. And today in China, there's about 56, I think, cars per 1,000 people, maybe 58. In India, it's still around 16. India is about to see an explosion of car purchasing, of industrialization, we think, over the coming years. This is going to be the power of the middle class. Russia will be selling commodities to this middle class, but also innovation in terms of some of the internet and technical innovation that's already happening here. This, I think, is a very positive story, as long as countries can get over the middle income trap, which George Magnus has been warning us about. And the governments have to deal with the demands on more money for education, more money for spending, but still supporting small businesses and keeping the country entrepreneurial. I think it's a big challenge. It's going to be a very interesting 5 to 10 years ahead. if I could thank you very much for coming, but also thank the panel for their fantastic thoughts. Thank you very much indeed.